What is the most damaging thing kids can be around, be exposed to? Domestic violence. Me and my wife rarely argue and never physically fight. I remember one time my wife and I were play fighting and our 3 or 4-year-old daughter burst into tears at the sight of it. Obviously, we stopped at that point. Contrast that with our ex-neighbors who used to fight and argue virtually every night. Let's just say we had very thin walls between our adjoining houses. Their similar-aged daughter would be playing in the same room, almost oblivious to what was going on around her, completely desensitized. It makes you wonder what her idea of a healthy relationship will look like when she gets older and starts dating, etc. I'm dating a woman who has had a tumultuous relationship with her ex, who has been very mentally and, prior to separating, physically abusive to her. They only split about a year ago, but her teenage sons are exhibiting behaviors towards her like their father did. The older one has started to cross some lines, and the whole situation is because their father thinks he's just getting back at his ex-wife and doesn't realize he's already destroyed his oldest son's ability to have healthy relationships with women. Came from a household where my dad was abusive to my mom and my mom was abusive to me. We've moved past those bad times as all of us became older and my parents became too old for violence. I still live with my parents, and when I hear them have a minor argument, or even just talking loudly to each other through the walls, I still freeze up like I did when I was a child. I still remember the days when I was a child, freezing up when I heard yelling and then springing into action when I heard the strikes being thrown. I moved out during college, and it was a completely alien experience to me to live in a home where I actually had a safe space. It didn't feel like I was hiding in my room anymore. Now I'm just saving up to move out so I can be a proper adult. Abuse, neglect, and violence. Of the three main abuse factors, neglect, wholly exploitive, and physical violence, emotional neglect, intentionally ignoring or negating a child's emotional expression, is now generally recognized as the most damaging. It alters the way brain learns to interact with your own body and how to interpret reality in a way that the brain and the body were not designed to manage. Emotional neglect is very often coupled with physical violence and wholly exploitation, which further exacerbates and compounds those factors, and the person will develop non-constructive and maladaptive behaviors to cope with the abuse. I worked that job and on for 12 years. The last family I worked for broke me down to the point I never want to work in home again. The family was so awful, all of both parents and the older siblings. The mother would talk about the girl I worked with right in front of her face. She would talk about how bad she was the night before, how kids ruined her life, she wishes she got an abortion, etc. The girl would get really upset and got to the point over the years where she would not want to be around her family at all. As she had staff with her 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. So essentially she was just getting her daughter bathed and in bed. She treated her like a baby even though she was in her 20s and acted like she couldn't understand anything anyone was saying about her. She was mostly nonverbal. She would say learned phrases, but that's mostly it. I got her comfortable enough to speak some on her own without fear before I left, but seeing her understand her family thought she was a burden was awful. I'm upset I couldn't stay with her, but I couldn't take it with the family anymore. They treated me like an idiot as well, and that on top of the constant caning was destroying my mental health. A co-parent who brainwashes a child against the other. My parents had a very nasty divorce when me and my twin brother were going from elementary school to middle school. We lived with our mom, and she would use us as pawns and would take us to every interaction she had with our dad, and these were always fights. She made us call the cops on him when he was outside our house. She dragged my brother along when she had to pick up something from him and he came back sobbing and in tears. She pressured us to testify against him. Me and my brother backed out on the day and never entered the courtroom. Not with my dad, but she even brought us along when she had to be confronted about her debt and how to pay it off. I cried in that room, and the other party yelled at me and told me they should be crying instead, because they have so much money owed to them. We were so young, and this lasted all through middle school and high school. I listened to what my mom said about my dad during my most impressionable years and hated him and became terrified of all men. Likewise, whenever we were with our dad, he said contradicting stories and tried to turn us against our mom. I dreaded car rides with him because that was all he would talk about. It made it hard to know who to trust. He also once told us the divorce was our fault that we could stop the fighting. He was referring to a time when me and my brother were 10-year-old. My brother cried and looked at me and said it was our fault. I genuinely still despise my dad for saying that. I now struggle with a lot of anxiety in my relationship. I hope to be better. It's hard not to just revert to blaming my childhood for my insecurities, but I know I can change. My parents rarely argued in front of us during the marriage, but the divorce was terrible. They fought so much. My dad once called the police on my mom because she wouldn't let him in the house. Neither of my parents are in any way violent or abusive, and I love them both very much. But damn, when I was 11, my mom would vent constantly about my dad and the divorce and how awful a parent he was to us, and that he doesn't care enough about us to stay in the same country. He now lives in another country. He's become a sort of holiday parent for me. I would start to agree with my mom that my dad is but then I'd go to my dad's and he'd tell me my mom was being difficult or lying to him, and I'd come back home siding with him. If you are getting a divorce, please never make the other one sound evil to make you look good in front of your kid. It really hurts. No kid wants to hear from their one parent that the other one is a bad person. Parents who think children are somehow lesser than adults in terms of respect, being heard, apologized to. Which isn't to say kids should have no boundaries or guidance. But parents refusing to apologize to a kid when the parent has behaved badly is so damaging. Hey sweetheart, I'm sorry I snapped. I'm feeling really tired today and I shouldn't have taken that out on you. Do over? Teaches them so much more than just doubling down and making them feel they shouldn't exist when a parent is in a bad mood. And all the stuff about not giving into things like using the kid's Favuti cup or whatever. I use my favorite mug for cough. I do the same for my partner. Just because if I can easily do something that gives a person I live a little bit of happiness, why wouldn't I? It's not spoiling them. It's just being nice to people. I work with kids between the ages of 7-12, all inner city youth. So foster kids, welfare kids, and just kids who had a bad home life. We had a lot of normal kids though too, for lack of a better word. The amount of kids who looked at me in absolute shock if I ever apologized for reacting. I shouldn't have raising my voice when I was too frustrated was just sad. My kids weren't listening one day and I put my foot down, so to speak, and kind of snapped from frustration by yelling over them to listen, and when they all quiet down I just sighed and said I'm sorry. That wasn't a good way to respond. I was just getting frustrated and I should not have raised my voice like that. Let's try this again, okay? So we did a redo. They got loud, and when I asked them to quiet down because now was a time to listen, they did, and we got into our next activity. One of the little boys approached me and just said, "Mrs. Toast, I don't think adults are supposed to apologize for yelling at kids. That's just what all adults do," in a very sweet tone. He genuinely thought anger and frustration was a normal response. I just let him know that adults are supposed to apologize too for having too big of a bad emotion, the same way kids are supposed to apologize to each other for hurting someone's feelings. And that just because they're kids, it does not mean I should be able to do it and feel like it's justified. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but I could have handled my big emotion a little better. So if me or my employees ever have a big emotion towards them, which is not often, sometimes kids are just loud and you have to talk over them for them to hear you. And it's frustrating not being heard at any age. I do a quick emotion talk with the kiddos and apologize if my loud voice comes off in a negative tone. It helps a ton, and it helps them convey their emotions to us a little better. Adults who can't control their emotions over small inconveniences or failures. My dad, he gets very loud and aggressive. My dad is very much against transgender and similar. When my half-sister came out as Demi, and that they were using the name Chris, my dad didn't yell. My sister lives with her mom states away. But I do remember how he reacted. He thought a mental institution would fix her. When I came out as non-binary, my dad said, "First, now you." That broke me to pieces. My dad yelled one time about how trans people and the world were ed up in the head after I came out. He yelled it at me because I'm really good friends with a trans male and wanted something to pin my mental issues on. He also blamed my favorite band because they happened to write dark music. Like he didn't buy me their merch. 8 Graves, by the way. Amazing people, really supportive. Also, the singer is like a father to me, just not as angry or loud. My dad yelled about everything that was just a highlight in my still-lasting childhood. Parents who don't have any emotional intelligence and don't know how to show love. Grew up with parents who never been hugged, therefore hugs were something I get on birthdays. I feel the need to clarify some things. My parents were very loving, but in their own ways. They made lots of presents, and my dad was a quality time kind of guy and would often take me swimming on the weekend when I was little. My mom was never a hugger. I asked her to hug me a few times in the last years, and I could tell it was uncomfortable to her. She often refused to hug me when I was crying. Both parents were and still are overwhelmed by me. I have lots of strong emotions. My mom can be cold. A few weeks ago, I had a mental breakdown and was screaming and hitting my head. I have bad depression and got diagnosed with ADHD in December. My mom was not even trying to calm me down before it happened. I sat next to her crying and she just said, "Okay, it's all good now. Stop now, please." My mom would never hug me, but we would lay together on the couch, and I would put my head on her belly. I was a kid that needed that a lot. I just rarely got it how I needed it. Generational trauma is to blame for this. Like I said, they never got hugged, but it affected my mom a lot. She had to be a housewife at 13, become her mother and father were working. I grew up with parents who were incapable of showing affection to us or each other. I don't remember ever hearing "I love you," "I'm proud of you," etc., or being hugged. They kicked me out when I was 14 by refusing to take me home from the hospital after I was violently assaulted. They signed me out and dropped me off at the bus station with a suitcase of clothes, my documents, and $100. Not even a kiss goodbye. When I had my first kid, I bought one of those watches with an alarm. Hey, it was 1995, and I set it to go off every 3 hours to remind me to be affectionate to my daughter. When it went off, I would smother her with kisses and tell her I loved her more than anything in the world. I actually trained myself to show affection. It worked. After a while, affection was natural. As she got older, I used it to remind me to use loving words and praise. I conditioned myself to be a loving mother. All my girls have turned out amazing. 2 have kids so far, and they are super loving to them. No alarms needed. The main emotion my dad showed growing up was anger. He was so quick to snap and start yelling and swearing. My mom was the same when I was younger, but mellowed out to the point she was emotionally absent as I got older. They stopped hugging or showing physical affection when I was super young. I distinctly remember once when I was about 4 years old when I had a nightmare and went to my parents' room for comfort. They told me, a terrified kid, to go back to bed and leave them alone. I sat in my room crying because I was so scared, until they came in and yelled at me to be quiet. Unfortunately for me, neither of them saw a problem with any of this. I'm now left with severe mental illnesses and problems with showing affection in my current relationships. There's moments where I can't hug my partner enough, and others where it feels wrong to hug them. Pedophiles, something I don't talk about often, but I was brought up in a loving, strict, grounded, 2-parent home. The only thing I could really say bad was my dad wasn't home as much as I wanted, and they were very religious. At 8 years old, I was groomed, and later molested by my father figure Sunday school teacher, and that turned a 12-year-old boy with a hood upbringing into a raging drug addict with anger problems and run-ins with the law for years. I've since come to grips with it, and recently turned my life around, but it took a long time. I'm still paying for my mistakes. Keep your children safe is my only message in this. They are the most precious gift you'll ever get, and you only get one chance to not screw them up. Being used as a pawn by parents during divorce. My sister and Bill had an amicable divorce, but then came the new wife. She wanted custody of the younger son because he was young and impressionable and still had several years of child support left, but didn't want anything to do with older son. The new wife convinced the courts that the older son was abusive to the younger and was a threat to him. He wasn't. This made it impossible to have both boys in the same house, so she was forced to choose. She chose to keep the younger son. Unfortunately, the new wife didn't want the older son either, so he was effectively homeless at 16. My sister let him stay sometimes but was deathly afraid the new wife would find out and take custody of the younger son. I was living overseas at the time and couldn't take him in. The older son started to stay with some questionable drug-abusing friends that convinced him he could drop out, get his GED, go to community college before his classmates even graduated high school. So, he dropped out and got his GED, but that's where he stopped. His friend just dropped out and never even got the GED. Eventually, his friends and him move on from light marijuana usage to opiate-based pills to meth. During all this, my sister has a complete mental breakdown and can't work because of the older son's descent into despair and the constant harassment from the new wife. Eventually, the new wife is able to convince the courts that my sister is to blame for all of this and gets custody of the younger son. My sister fights for a while longer but figures the instability damaging the younger son, so decides to give up. She hasn't got to see her younger son in over 15 years at this point. The new wife has probably poisoned his mind to her. The older son has been in and out of rehab but has lots of problems that I believe were rooted in his abandonment by both parents. Those parents who want to always stay with their child like a police helicopter, they end up not being able to do anything alone when they come to the real world. Also, later in life, parents who control their children's lives so they don't make mistakes or go out of bounds. Making non-critical mistakes and breaking the rules when it does not harm others is one of the single most important things for the development of a successful adult. Additionally, this mindset can also develop a healthy questioning of authority. I suspect some of the damage this mindset causes is because the rules are abstract and toothless. This causes not just a fear of risk but also, in rebellion, will not enable the non-critical or without harming others corner of risk-taking. Literally, their parents. If they are clueless about how to properly care for their child, especially during the first 5 years, the damages can last a lifetime and are very difficult to help. My wife is a teacher and she came home the other day infuriated. She discovered a student of hers was cutting, like fresh cuts, and as a mandated reporter she brought it up with her principal, who then contacted the girl's parents. They sat the parents down and offered to assist with a school counselor or direct them to a therapist who can maybe help get to the source and work with the young girl. You know what her father said? He said they refused to take her to therapy because the therapist will make her question if she's even still a girl anymore. This dude then threatened to take her out of the school if they did anything. She's physically hurting herself, and all this young man can think about is stupid culture war bull. She's going to have scars from this, and not just physical ones. Unregulated internet, trust me. I babysit to different families. One gives the kids super restricted internet access. They have one game and the camera. The other is far too easy on the kids when it comes to screen control. I've seen these kids grow up, unable to be imaginative or creative. Everything gets fed to them in an everlasting stream of mind-numbing useless information. The other kids, well, act like kids. They invent stories, make games, dens, theater shows, you name it. It's also important that kids get bored. They start finding things to do and using their mind to help them problem solve instead of just turning on YouTube and staring at a screen. Pedophile family members. We don't just stay away from person, you need to cut person out of your life and have open and serious conversations about bodily autonomy, saying no, and talking to a trusted adult from toddlerhood on. Kids need to know proper body part names, and that those private body parts are never to be touched by someone else, and that grown-ups are not allowed to ask them to keep secrets. I wish I had known any of this growing up, but my family was more into looking the other way and completely ignoring it. Also, domestic violence. Parents addicted to drugs. Unrestricted internet access at a young age, even as a young teen. Forms of instant gratification and easy stimulation. I grew up with video games and TV. My parents did all the chores and only focused on giving me a dream childhood. I appreciate their efforts, don't get me wrong, but now I find myself an adult in a world I'm ill-equipped for. It requires a lot of focus and determination to do tasks that need to be done but aren't as flashy and instantly rewarding. When I have kids, I still want them to have a good childhood. But I want them to recognize the value of hard work, and I want to avoid setting them up for addiction to artificially high-stimulating activities. Smokers. Secondhand smoke inhalation is still very damaging to a person's lungs, even more so for a child, and the fact that it's so commonplace means that a lot of kids are exposed to it daily. It also means that kids are more likely to pick up smoking, because they see their parents do it and think it's okay, and then get hooked on nicotine. It also causes things like lung diseases, COPD, strokes, cancer, and heart diseases, with cancer and heart disease being the top two leading reasons for death in the United States. People have said the abusive parents thing, so I'll skip that. All things being equal, the worst thing a child can be exposed to is an overly supportive environment. There's a lot of people that think you need to constantly encourage the child, tell them they're right, agree with them, and support their views. The truth is that the child is a developing person. They need honest feedback in order to learn and grow. Blowing smoke up a kid might make you feel good in the short term, and it might even give them a brief ego boost. But if a kid's wrong, they need to be told they're wrong and why. Otherwise, you end up with an emotionally and intellectually stunted adult who'll likely end up with a ton of mental health issues, because the world isn't kissing there anymore now that they're grown and they don't know how to deal with it. There's a line here, and as a parent, my standard with this type of guidance is to stick to the facts, not present my opinion as fact, which is something my mother did that really messed me up. Here's what I mean. If my kid came to me and was like, "Mom, I want to be a professional video game streamer when I grow up," I would not shut that down immediately by saying, "Do you have any idea how few people make it in that field?" He and I would look up the facts on it together. Do you have to go to college for esports in order to get that kind of gig? How did most successful ones get their start? How much is the average streamer making? Not the big names, the middle 50%, since statistically that's where more people end up. What kind of background do these people have? What marketing do they do, and what does that cost? Are there agents? My job isn't to squash ideas that I might find ridiculous on first glance, because my kids are growing up to live in a world that I know nothing about, since it's changed a lot since I was their age. Maybe my son can be a professional video game streamer and I'm the one who doesn't have the facts. So we find the facts and let them speak for themselves. Are you in the top whatever % of the game you want to do this with? Do you have as many followers as that really famous person had at your age? I have found that when done this way, learning the facts together and reserving judgment, they tend to come to the conclusion I would have on their own. This is very different than my mom telling me horror stories about how terrible life is for lesbians, something she knows nothing about because she is straight every time I attempted to come out. I'm sure she thought she was just teaching me how the world worked, but she was shoving me into the closet for her own comfort. And the therapy to deal with that as an adult was expensive and time-consuming. None of the things she said were even true. I think a lot of times, parents speak from a place of fear or anxiety about their kids' futures and will present bias as fact, and that's definitely to be avoided. Sticking to the facts and advising appropriately is good, though. Unhappy teachers outside the home. This is the #1 thing bringing the whole of our society down. Kids don't generally see their parents at work, but they do see teachers at work all day more than half of the year. Teachers don't just teach students through direct instruction. In fact, the most powerful teaching tool is modeling. Kids learn best from what they see adults do. When kids only see unhappy, underpaid teachers who are just grinding out for the pension and have lost passion, they learn that this is what an adult worker looks like. This becomes their model, and then they grow up to hate their work and grind without purpose. There are numerous other reasons to attend to teacher happiness, but this is the one doing the most damage to our society and our children.